Welcome to my ready room. I'm Murdoch, and this is 5 Minute Trek, where I've got 5 minutes to give you the rundown on a Star Trek vessel. Today we're looking at the Excelsior Class, Starfleet's great transwarp experiment that also just proved to be a home run in the built-to-last department. If there was one other vessel after the Miranda class that seemed to just be a standout machine that would give as good as it got and keep going, it was the Excelsior. This vessel's prototype namesake, the NX-2000, later redesignated NCC-2000, Excelsior was originally commissioned in 2284 and was the testbed for what was to be a transwarp drive by the 2280 standard. So, small disclaimer, the warp scale back then was measured differently than it is now. Still, it was to be the great experiment, and the Admiralty of the time was very excited to see it work. And from my understanding, there were some political machinations at play during the time too. Because, Star Trek, when isn't there politics? Lawrence Stiles had managed to make some sort of play to bump our man Hikaru Sulu from the captain's chair in her maiden voyage, thanks to the events of the duel with Khan, the Genesis planet made from a protomatter device, and Spock's some difficult-to-explain resurrection. This great experiment would ultimately have been sabotaged when Admiral Kirk took it upon himself to go looking for Spock on the Genesis planet and poaching one Montgomery Scott from Stiles in the process. Scott was noted to have not been very fond of the new transwarp drive, mentioning, and I quote, "The more they overthink the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up the drain." While Starfleet Command would have Jim Kirk by his nethers for the stunts he pulled over the course of the search for Spock and the voyage home, Mr. Stiles would never live down the humiliation of being left in the Enterprise's space dust with nicknames like Stiles Without Substance or Dry Dock Stiles. I kind of feel sorry for him, though. His career really didn't end very well. The Excelsior class would also have the honor of counting the third Starfleet ship with the name Enterprise among its numbers, as the Enterprise B was minted in 2293, shortly before James Kirk's disappearance during the Nexus event. Enterprise B being its own little variant subclass from the original design, with some tweaks and modifications to the hardware, and some of the silhouette of the ship. There's a bit more material here and there, as I mentioned before. Enterprise B was chosen to be an Excelsior due to how these ships could stand the test of time. This decision was viewed as controversial back then, thanks to the stigma from Stiles' failed pursuit. However, history has proven that to be a non-issue. Enterprise B, for all her gusto, would ultimately be lost in deep space somewhere in the Bajor sector in 2328, a year after Cardassia had annexed Bajor, prompting the commissioning of Enterprise C. The Excelsior herself got the distinguishing case of being a major part of the reason that ships on exploration and non-wartime missions were allowed and later designed to also house families of the crew. Turns out, while she was on an exploratory mission, disciplinary action was attempted to be levied against an officer who had demanded leave for an important family matter. So we have the poor fella who shall remain nameless to thank for Starfleet adopting the idea of ships having enough space to accommodate their crew and their families during peacetime missions. New for the 25th century, the Advanced Ship Design Bureau decided to retrofit and redesign a couple new variants of the venerable class. These are the Resolute and the Repulse classes. The Excelsior reimagined for the new era, each sporting the classic profile with some notable differences. Okay, horsepower time. What could these vessels actually do? Well, for starters, and because of the whole civilians on Starfleet ships thing, they figured out saucer separation for this ship after it became a standard in the 24th century, for one. For two, during their earlier service life, ships of the line would use an improved version of the quadritransducer shield, say that 3 times fast, that was in use in the later part of the 23rd century, as it was found to have better deflection capability. In terms of armaments, these too changed and updated over time. The best example of that being the USS Lakota, which got retrofitted with quantum torpedoes and likely better phaser arrays than the Type 8s that would have been installed all over the superstructure when she first left dry dock. That being said, the Excelsior class was no slouch for defending herself beforehand either. The initial Mark I design featured 16 phaser banks and 4 torpedo bays. Now, it's not entirely clear to me if these early versions of the vessel were also using the more automated torpedo loading mechanisms that would become mainstream by the 24th century yet, but even if they were, you don't want to be on the business end of one of any of them, just torpedoes, not fun. How fast were these vessels? Well, using the modern scale for warp, the Excelsior could hit warp 9 on its own, assuming it wasn't chasing an Enterprise. The refit models of the 24th century would squeeze a bit more performance from their warp drives and reach a maximum of warp 9.6. There were at least 78 known Excelsior class vessels produced by Starfleet over these years, though I fear many of them were lost in the Battle of Wolf 359 because of Starfleet's lack of understanding of the Borg, being too new a threat to have properly had time to analyze them. We'd learn from that, though. That's it for this episode. I'll see you in the next one.